Welcome to Forum 360, the show with a global view but a local perspective. I'm Sally Henning. Our topic today is trade, tariff, and Trump, triumph or tragedy. To discuss these concerns, we welcome back to Forum 360 our distinguished guests from Case Western University Law School, Dr. Juscelino Colares, to share his unique international and local insights. Dr. Colares is the Schout van den Einde Professor of Law at Case Western Reserve University, which I'm sure I messed up. He's a graduate of graduate attorney from Cornell Law School, and he practiced law at Dewey Ballantine, a law firm in Washington, D.C., where he litigated cases before federal agencies, federal courts, and NAFTA panels. Dr. Colares clerked for the Chief Justice of the French Supreme Court before coming to the United States. And we welcome you back to Forum 360.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So we're talking today about trade. And tell me, you are supposed to have written the preeminent book on trade and all of its issues.
On renegotiating trade agreements.
That's the preeminent book. My question for you is, should Mr. Trump have read the book?
He doesn't need to.
Okay.
Because the book covers an area of so-called law and economics that has to do a lot with how people behave, called rational decision-making and game theory. And President Trump has that intuitively. He understands where are the points of leverage in any negotiation. He's written a book about that. And what the book says in terms of the theory of rational decision-making and behavioral models maps pretty well with his intuition. So the book was written, published in 2021, and it talks about why. It asks a very interesting question, which is, if there are agreements that are not beneficial to a particular country, and if situations change in countries when they sign agreements and eventually things change, why don't they renegotiate? Why do we see so few renegotiation of agreements? Which led to, a lot of people to question or second guess President Trump in his first term when he renegotiated NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, into the United States, Mexico, Canada Agreement, USMCA. And so academia reacted like wildly. Why is the president touching this? Why is he renegotiating this? And my question was, well, first of all, the Vienna Convention on the Law of Nations basically has specific provisions that provide for agreement renegotiation, treaty renegotiation. Why is it that academia found it so weird that the president was doing it? So that motivated me to write about it. And the reason, so I used game theory to kind of explain in a different context so that people wouldn't be because some people are so emotional about President Trump that if you say that he's doing something right, you've lost him at the beginning. So I found a trade agreement in Turkey, the customs union between Turkey and the European Union, as a good example of a very bad trade agreement, in that case for Turkey, trade agreement. Turkey gets other things from the EU, although it's not a member. And I explained how Turkey gets leveraged all the time by Europe and why, surprisingly, Turkey doesn't renegotiate. So I try to formulate a theory why certain agreements, although they're bad, they're not renegotiated, although countries should be renegotiating agreements much more.
Because things change.
Things change, but the problem is presidents find a lot of resistance from the bureaucracy, from the so-called administrative state.
Easier to just keep driving.
And it's easier. Presidents are there for 4 years and the bureaucracy is there forever. So the bureaucracy tends to play against the president, and the president, because they are presidents, most of them are career politicians, they think that it's a much lower cost for them to just leave things and kick the can down the road, which is a formula that very predictable presidents since Ronald Reagan to now, they have been on trade, because nobody wants to fix any problem on trade, just kick the can down the road and the trade deficit keeps going higher. But in the case of Turkey, the same phenomenon happens. So I demonstrated that was a bad trade agreement, and I kind of explained how Turkey should proceed to renegotiate it with the Europeans, because Turkey has something that, with the Europeans, that President Trump has with most of the world. Turkey has what the United States doesn't have, which is tariff leverage. And the United States has very low tariffs. Turkey has very high tariffs. So Turkey can always bargain, because look, use its tariffs to basically say, look, I'm gonna give you less tariffs if you agree to do this with me. But Turkey doesn't do it. In the case of the United States, we're already close to the zero bound, to zero tariffs. Our average level of tariffication is around 2% or less than 2% of all goods that enter the United States. So we have very little to give in trade negotiations. President Trump perceives this. So the book is not about President Trump, but the book is the kind of thing that President Trump kind of maps out in terms of game theory, pretty much what President Trump thinks when he does trade.
Now, you recently spoke at a seminar between U.S. and Canadian trade relations. Can you tell the audience a bit about that seminar and what you talked about?
Yes, I did. Case Western hosts the United States-Canada Law Institute. And this year, I believe, was the 49th conference. And so we organized the conference. Steve Petrus is the co-director. And he organized it, and he invited me to come to a panel where we would discuss the future of USMCA and the so-called rules-based trade system. And the Canadians were all there. The Canadians came. They always come in heavy numbers, and diplomats and former diplomats. And they were all very irritated. This was in late April. And,
the diplomats from Canada.
Sorry, the diplomats. And I basically, told them that the president has the authority to do what he's doing. Canada needs to cooperate with the United States on fentanyl, on immigration matters, and there's no reason why Canada can basically legitimately say that it should be holding tariffs on our dairy at above 200%, for example, and then say they do free trade with the United States, which they do not. Plus, they subsidize a lot of their goods. So they heard it directly from me, and kind of I gave an assessment of what would be a good path for Canada to follow in negotiating President Trump. They're now under a 90-day reprieve on the reciprocal tariffs, and the fentanyl tariffs, they want a 60-day reprieve too, the Canadians.
Can you explain for our audience what a reciprocal trade tariff is? Basically,
reciprocal, very, very simple. Where President Trump basically said that for a period of time until we renegotiate and rebalance our trade relations with other countries, we're going to adopt a policy that we will charge to your goods the same tariffs that you currently charge to our goods entering your country.
So that sounds fair. What's the problem? What's the objection to that?
Well, I would say it sounds inherently fair, but there is a concept in economic theory called the theory of comparative advantage, that we tend to do better. We tend to do better if every country focuses on what it does best, and then what it doesn't do as efficiently as others, then it should let other countries trade with it, so that countries produce more, and on the aggregate they trade more for a lower cost. But that theory, of course, is a theory that ignores power relations between countries and ignores the long-term effect of running systemic trade deficits, which is what the president is trying to address. And the reciprocal tariffs are a mechanism the president is using to try to get people to the bargaining table, because by just saying, we're going to reduce our tariffs to you from 2% to 0 is not really a good convincing argument, is it?
No. So some people are calling the current trade atmosphere one of crisis. Have you heard that expression, and do you think that's overblown or apt description?
I think it's overblown, first of all, and my question to them is, why is it a crisis to basically say to other countries that we're going to do to you exactly what you do to us, right? It seems inherently normal that a country from time to time may want to reassess based on its capabilities and based on its interests, its relationships, right? And of course, trade is part and parcel of diplomacy involves trade, right? And so why is it uncouth? Why is it not nice to basically say, no, wait a second, here's our trade relationship. It seems to be very unbalanced, and it seems to never adjust, although, the American economy has been growing significantly. The Canadian, for example, the Canadian economy has grown by about 0.5%. GDP has grown in the last 10 years.
That sounds pretty good.
That's very bad. 0.5% overall.
Oh.
The entire growth. Canada has only added 0.5% to its GDP in 10 years. That's under former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. So it's a very poor performance. The United States, on the other hand, has had growth rates that are average around at least 2.1% per year. So cumulatively, the United States is today a much wealthier economy, right, than Canada. So we can produce more natural gas and oil. So we're less dependent on, or reliant rather, on Canada on energy, which is one of the driving forces for having a free trade agreement with them in the 1980s. So the Canadians are the ones who need to convince us, why we should keep everything the same when everything changed.
Yeah.
Right? We are a much more dynamic economy. We produce at much lower energy costs. We are undergoing an AI revolution, and of course that it demands a lot of energy, right? A lot of all these server farms, artificial intelligence. And the United States has positioned itself to be in the leadership in that sector because we can produce energy for a lower cost. So our capabilities have changed. We are a much more dynamic economy. So why shouldn't we look at our relationship and say, no, you're not going to charge our dairy 260%, for example, over a certain quota. No, you're not going to basically become just an assembly line for European or Chinese goods, so that autos, the autos come into the United States at 2.5%, and by basically you claiming that they have a very high content of North American because they were production because they were produced in your country. We're not going to allow you to become a base for Chinese manufacturing, so that the Chinese can enter our market.
Well, we'll talk more about that,
Yeah.
but first let me reintroduce you to our audience. You're watching Forum 360. Our special guest today is Professor Juscelino Colares, a professor at Case Western Reserve University,
Yes.
Where he's involved with the practice of law,
And
as well as
federal courts, civil procedure, and trade.
And trade.
Yeah.
And you're involved with trade representatives and what used to be called NAFTA?
Yes, I'm in the U.S. roster of used to be the NAFTA, now it's the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA arbitrators.
Right, you just made a mention with respect to China. We'll talk about that later. But,
Sure.
But first, I want to ask what alternative ideas the president might be using to affect international trade in a positive way for the United States, in addition to tariff changes.
So the idea is, the tariffs are there basically as a move to basically get people to sit down and say, look, what you think was on the table, which is the tariffs that we have been offering you, which are very low tariffs versus your very high tariffs, right, are no longer on the table. We're going to take that off. And I'm going to charge you something that is inherently fair, the same thing that you charge us. So now, can you hear me? Now are you listening to me? And then once parties come and start negotiating, of course, we're gonna bring them down. And for now, at least with the exception of China, countries have won a 90-day reprieve so that we can, Secretary Lutnick and Besant of the Treasury can basically do these deals.
What are some of the constraints that the president and his team face as they try to right the ship with respect to international trade issues?
Yes, it's a very good question because, first of all, the tool you have is the use of tariffs. Our Constitution basically gives to Congress, under Article 1, the power to regulate foreign commerce. It's one of the three, commerce clauses. So there's an interstate commerce clause that people are familiar with, the Indian commerce clause, and the international trade commerce clause, international commerce clause. So Congress has the power, the ultimate tariff authority, but Article 2 of the Constitution bestows on the United States President all the executive powers of the United States. And one of these powers is the power to conduct foreign relations, or foreign relations power. So in a way, the founding generation of this country split the power to negotiate trade agreements, or deals, right, if you will, between the Congress and the President. And since President Harry S. Truman, in the beginning of the post-war Cold War period, Congress has transferred a lot of that tariff power or authority, has delegated that authority to the president. That's why President Trump is so uniquely positioned to basically, act by, moving or changing the tariffs to basically entice people to come down and sit at the table. Status quo would not get the people to come and talk. That's happening now.
So what are the major constraints to him?
The major constraints obviously are time, right? Well, first of all, the midterms come, in less than 2 years, in about a year and a half from now. In about a year and a half from now, we're going to be deep in campaigning for the midterms. The economy and the adjustments and all the investment that he also is bringing to the United States, foreign direct investment, which is booming, will be felt or should be felt by that time, so that then the president can communicate to the public that his strategy is being vindicated. Look at our growth rates. It's interesting, your question, because 2 days ago, I think last Friday, the jobs numbers came out, and the labor, the new employment numbers were higher, beat expectations at 177,000 jobs, private sector jobs, which is something we were not seeing during the Biden administration. And yet you saw a decline in government jobs, which is the opposite of what happened in the Biden administration. The quality of our growth is much improved, and this is only the beginning. I mean, and you, as you said, to use your ship analogy, the ship is turning. So time being a constraint, the president needs to turn the ship and get the ship to basically start moving towards an economic boom, a lot of growth, like we saw in his first term in the first 3 years before COVID, right? A lot of that reshoring of manufacturing, which is going to be highly automated and with robots and everything. It's not just we're not going to be building iPhones with the same technologies that maybe we're even building today, because they're going to be robots that kind of be fine-tuned to doing certain things. So a lot of that manufacturing is being reshored, and so the president needs time to turn the economy. That's one constraint. Another constraint, I would say, is also the high level of debt, public debt, that this country has. The government debt is at beyond 36 trillion right now, and that debt needs to be refinanced from time to time. And if the government continues spending as much as it has, we have a big spending problem, which has been trying to address. Congress and DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, is trying to address. All these things are being done so that we can show credibly in the markets that we're not going to be outcompeting the private sector by the government becoming the big borrower out there, that we're going to spend less. We're going to cut expense. We're going to cut fraud, waste, and abuse, right? To repeat the phrase that's often repeated. They're often mentioned with respect to DOGE, so that then we can position our economy to a better quality and long-lasting growth. So time, reducing the debt, all of these things, they are not simple things to do. And to get trade partners to actually negotiate with us, we may have to ruffle feathers, because people like to keep the good bargains they have against us. Why should Germany be upset with the United States? Why shouldn't they be upset with the United States when they can get their cars here at 2.5% tariffs, whereas our cars get their 20-25% tariffs, right?
How big a constraint is China?
It's a big constraint because, you know, they're a centralized government. They're, of course, a dictatorship, and they are very dynamic at making a decision and implementing it, because it's not like the United States where you have divided power or checks and balances, right? And the leader, you know, Xi Jinping wants something, it happens. So they have a big advantage in that way. But our big advantage, on the other hand, is ordered liberty. We have freedom, right, in this country. And because of that, that's why I don't think people should bet against this country, because the American people, when push comes to shove, they make the right choices and they choose the right policies. They can see, they vote with their pocketbooks, in other words. So China has an advantage because, in a way, they're efficient in getting government, you know, to subsidize private enterprise. And it's a matter of nationalistic pride in China to have a manufacturing plant and to, you know, do as much as they can, including use government, you know, information to engage in intellectual property theft, which damages our manufacturers. And we are basically saying, no, we don't want to trade on these terms. The trade system was not created to organize, to basically to allow this system. So now we are creating a new sandbox, and China is isolated in its own sandbox. China doesn't want the world, especially America, to see the pain that it is having right now because orders are collapsing. And of course, in the short term, you have, you know, people overreacting in the markets because people, you know, the markets don't like uncertainty.
We're seeing a bit of volatility.
You're seeing volatility, but at the same time, the last 10 days in a row, what you've seen is the S&P with consecutive gains, and we haven't seen that in more than 20 years. So it's a period of volatility, no question. But I think that as the president and his team announce accomplishments like what we now have a secure border, right? We now have different policies with the big, beautiful, so-called big, beautiful bill passing Congress by summer. Will signal to, you know, the markets out there that the government is, you know, at least beginning to address its spending problem. It's keeping the debt, the deficits, government deficits in check, and that with the reforms that are going to come through DOGE and in collaboration with the different departments, we're going to position our economy for growth, for good quality growth, not growth in the public sector, but growth in the private sector.
So what do you see as the opportunities or the things that the president could do?
Yeah, this is a time of enormous opportunity, because what we see is we are as I said, we're undergoing an AI revolution, right? The methods, the way we produce goods and services is undergoing and is going to undergo a fundamental change in the next 5 years. And while the Europeans are busy regulating everything or every business they possibly can, we are basically trying to unleash them. And by providing lower energy costs and these computing power, server farms, etc., they need a lot of power. And there's no civilization in the history of mankind that became richer by consuming less energy. Right? The richer you become, the more energy you're going to consume. The president again is addressing that. So this is a period of great opportunity, because while the Europeans are concerned about regulating all their industries, we're basically unleashing them. We're cutting down red tape, we're cutting down regulations. So that's a period that we're going to see, and this is why I think people between 18 and 30 voted for Trump. Right?
What about the rare earth issue with China restricting these minerals? What's the impact of that going to be? How does that get dealt with?
They do have leverage, and in fact, they've already begun using it, which shows how perceptive this administration is. We just signed a deal with Ukraine, because they have rare earths too. We're looking, the Department of the Interior is looking at freeing up and deregulating and allowing so we can produce some of these here too, under safe environmental conditions. So it's a multi-front approach. And what China is doing is exactly what the Trump administration expected them to do.
So is there time for a new trade framework?
It is, absolutely. We could not basically, everything we were doing was benefiting China. We cannot just be subsidizing our geopolitical arch rival, a country that basically does not act responsibly, a country that basically, when it sees the Houthis attacking Western ships, right, in that part of the world, but all of a sudden Russian and Chinese ships are passing by. So it's a country that does not, and it only looks at itself. It looks at everything. It is not a guarantor of free and fair trade. To the opposite.
So are Secretaries Bessent and Ludnick taking calls?
They are. They are taking calls, and they are meeting with a lot of people all the time. There is talks that we are very close to a framework with India, deal with India, South Korea, Japan, etc.
We can talk some more. Welcome again to our show again, and thank you for appearing on behalf of Forum 360. We appreciate Professor Juscelino Colares coming again to Forum 360. On behalf of Forum 360, I'm Sally Henning.
Forum 360 is brought to you by John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, the Akron Community Foundation, Hudson Community Television, the Rubber City Radio Group, Shaw Jewish Community Center of Akron, Blue Green, Electric Impulse Communications, and Forum 360 supporters.